Way back during World War I, a very famous man that I'm sure you heard of named J.R.R. Tolkien was in the trenches in World War I, and it was a dreadful, horrible time. He had a friend. His name was C.S. Lewis. You've probably heard of him too. Well, Tolkien, during the war, to keep himself from literally losing his mind, he began to invent stories, and he began to invent entire languages. He was a language professor at, I believe it was Oxford, but he was very well known, so he created his own languages, including Elvish and a number of others. These are real languages. They have a real dictionary. They have a real syntax. They have a real everything. But the thing about Professor Tolkien was that he was also a professing, very strong Christian. He was actually part of the group that led C.S. Lewis to the Lord. They had a little literary group where they would get around and tell stories and things like this, called it the Inklings. And he was part of the group that led C.S. Lewis to Christ. And we know how much Professor Lewis has had an influence on Christianity over the years. Well, Tolkien wrote stories, and one of those stories you've probably heard of is called The Lord of the Rings. And The Lord of the Rings is actually an analogy. If you study it, many of his characters are designed around either biblical characters or biblical concepts. And I want to point out something. How many of you are familiar with The Lord of the Rings? You've seen the film or read the book. You know what I'm talking about. Well, Professor Tolkien created several characters. One of them is Boromir. Most of you may remember Boromir. He was a powerful man. He was an honorable man. He was noble. He was very self-assertive, but he had a very wild strength. He was driven by his passions. And how many of you know the story? That was his undoing, wasn't it? In the end, he was undone because his emotions and his power and his nobility were not under control. And I believe that Tolkien wrote him that way on purpose to contrast him with another man, Aragorn, king of Gondor. Now, Aragorn was completely different. We know him as a hero. Tolkien intentionally wrote him after the character of Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, if you read the story, you know that later that Aragorn goes through the paths of the dead. In other words, he faces death in order to bring deliverance. So he's very much a character that's designed to make you think of who Jesus was. And when you read the character, when you see the film, you see Aragorn is a man of tremendous strength and tremendous nobility and loyalty, just like Boromir. The difference is that his strength was always under control. It was always restrained. He was willing to endure exile. He was willing to fight when necessary. However, he did not demand his rights. He had the right to the throne of Gondor, but he did not demand it. The needs of other people were more important to Aragorn than his own honor. That was very different than Boromir. Very different. Now, most of you may remember the scene. I wanted to show it this morning, but we don't have the technology to be able to show the video clip. But I wanted to show the death scene of Boromir because it's a powerful scene. How many of you remember it from the film? Boromir has literally, he's just faced the biggest test of his life and failed. The temptation to take the ring from Frodo was so overwhelming to him. Again, that strength that he had was not under control. His passions were not under control. And when they came out, he tried to forcibly take the ring from Frodo. And in that moment, he realized his failure. And he was horribly, horribly remorseful for it. And as it was tearing himself up, the opportunity came for him. Are you going to defend the other hobbits or not? And sure enough, Boromir pulls out his sword and he fights to defend Pippin and Merry. But it's a losing battle. He's wounded unto death. And then we see this beautiful scene where Aragorn comes up and he says, Boromir says, I failed. I failed you. And Aragorn says, no. You've redeemed yourself. You retained your honor. You did the right thing in the end. And it's in that moment that Boromir knows, he knows in his heart that Aragorn is the greater man. Why? Aragorn is the same. They're willing to fight. They're both willing to fight. They just came out of a battle. They're both noble. They're both loyal. They're both these things. But Aragorn had his strength under control. And Boromir did not. But in that last moment, Boromir recognizes the greater man. And he takes his sword and he puts it on his chest and he says, I would have followed you, my captain, my king. And then he dies. It's a powerful scene. Tears coming down Aragorn's face. It's funny, I was watching how they made the film, and they said it was so emotional in that moment when they were shooting it, there was not a dry eye behind the camera. And everybody at the end, Peter Jackson was talking about how they shot the scene, and it was just so overwhelming to them, the nobility of this character, Aragorn. You know, it's funny, at the end of the shooting of this film, this was shot in New Zealand, and at the end of this, the Maori tribesmen who were a part of, there were many of the characters, many of the extras, they did a very special thing for Aragorn. He was still in his outfit. They had just finished shooting the last scene. I mean, Viggo Mortensen was the actor, but in that moment, he was still Aragorn. And as he came out of his trailer to film the last scene, the Maori tribesmen got together and they did a big ceremony. Again, I wanted to show it to you, but I didn't have the technology. Where the Maori, they slap themselves and they're a Polynesian kind of a culture. And they did this ceremony that is only ever done for royalty. They recognized how powerful this character was. And what Tolkien wants you to understand, listen carefully, what Tolkien was trying to get across to you through this story is what is the picture of true nobility, true greatness. The Bible sums this up in one word, meekness. It's a powerful word that we do not understand in our culture anymore. But the Bible wants you to understand this. The Bible wants you to emulate this. Take a look at Colossians chapter 3. We've been studying Colossians chapter by chapter and verse by verse. We got up to chapter 12. We had to stop. Because it says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. It says we're supposed to put these virtues on as intentionally as we put our clothing on. But if we don't understand these virtues, how can we put them on? How can we practice them? So I've decided to go through each one of these to understand them deeper. And that word gentleness there in the NIV version, the King James actually translates that word differently. It translates that word as meekness. But because in our 21st century culture, we don't understand what meekness is, the NIV translates it as gentleness. But gentleness is nowhere near what meekness is. Aragorn is what meekness is. If you really want to understand it, think about that character. Tolkien intentionally wrote him to show the power of meekness. And the first thing you need to know is that meekness is not weakness. How many of you know that there was no one more feared in battle than Aragorn? When he got angry and pulled out the sword of the West, everybody fled before him. So meekness is not weakness. It's not weakness. What it is it is a strength and a power and a nobility that is always under control. It's used when it's needed, not when it's not needed. Boromir didn't get that. And that's why his strength became arrogance. That's why his strength and his nobility became a prejudicial looking down on others. How many of you know that Aragorn was always the servant of everybody around him? And yet he was the more dangerous in battle. Tolkien wrote that intentionally so that you could understand it. And the Bible says we need to understand it. Meekness is not only a strength that's under control, but it's a strength that's willing to endure trouble with patience, to endure a challenge without resentment. And how many of you know you're going to need that when you have children? How many of you know you're going to need that if you're married? We all need to understand meekness. We need to get it. Now, the word meekness in the original language in Greek means a disposition or a mildness of spirit, but it's actually a reference to domesticating certain kinds of animals. When you think about a horse, a wild horse is a powerful, majestic creature, beautiful, dangerous. You get out there in the wild, you don't want to meet a stallion like this, it's going to hurt you. It's going to hurt you. They're unpredictable. But a horse like this that is tamed to the saddle and the bit, this is an animal that's just as strong, just as majestic, just as powerful. C.S. Lewis writes in his book, The Horse and the Boy, he's trying to get this same concept across. Remember, Tolkien and Lewis were friends. They sat around and talked about these concepts. So Lewis made sure that everybody understood that the horse was this character of strength and power and beauty and nobility under control and just as dangerous in battle as the soldier sitting on his back. Because a war horse was trained to know when to rear and when to come down so that the blow of the sword would come down with the same strength as the horse. It's strength under control. That's what the Greek word means. It refers directly to a horse. It's this concept of what meekness is. And this is the bottom line. Meekness is a determined power that is under control. Now, you men out there have a strength and a power that God has given you. But if it's not under control, it can become abusive in your marriage. If it's not under control, it can become arrogant foolishness in your job, and you can lose that job because it's a strength that's out of control. It's Boromir, not Aragorn. You've all, men, been given that strength. Ladies, you have all been given a different kind of strength, but it's every bit as powerful. I know this because I have seen a mother defend her child, and it's a dangerous thing. You don't want to cross that mother bear. But it's a strength that needs to be under control by the Holy Spirit. If not, you become a controlling woman that is trying to put her husband under her thumb all the time, and her kids too. Without meekness, we destroy our family relationships. It is the strength that God has given you, but it's out of control. And when it's out of control, it becomes destructive. And it's not the horse that we want. Does that make sense? Now, to understand what this really looks like, I want to take you back into the Old Testament. I want to step back in time to September 605 years before Jesus was born. 605 BC, that's 2,500 years ago, when this guy, a man named Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. When he came there, it had been warned by the prophets that the people of Israel had been going after other gods and doing evil things. They'd been warned for centuries, and he was the instrument of judgment. And when he came, he literally killed tens of thousands of people. He was absolutely brutal. When you look at real history, Nebuchadnezzar was just plain savage. He was not afraid to take his captives and to kill them all and to hang their bodies on stakes. He would impale them, put them all the way around the city and let them rot, just so he could say, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't open that gate. He was brutal. And when he was done destroying the city of Jerusalem and he leveled it, brought down the walls, destroyed the temple, did everything you can imagine. He deported more than 40,000 people as slaves. He took them more than 1,000 miles back to Babylon and said, now you belong to me. Nobody messed with this guy. In fact, Babylon was the world's first true superpower. It controlled an empire from the borders of what is today Iran all the way to Egypt, north all the way to the Caspian Sea. The world's first true superpower. And during that deportation, there was a teenager that was brought out from the land of Israel all the way to Babylon. He was somewhere between the ages of 14 and 16, and his name was Daniel. He wrote a book, which we still have. Daniel was taken during that time and deported, and I want you to understand the real history of this. This was not easy for Daniel. We read the story, but we haven't got the historical time period in our minds. Please understand, Daniel lost everything he had. He was part of an upper class family. He went from upper class to slave overnight. And not only that, his entire family had been murdered. His mom, his dad, his cousins, everybody, they were all dead. And there was absolutely no guarantee that he was going to survive this. Not only did he lose all of that, but he lost his language as well. Because when you go to this foreign country, you're in a foreign culture, foreign language, not even allowed to speak it anymore, which is why part of the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. And when he was taken there, it got even worse. And I don't want to gross you out, but the truth of the matter is that Daniel was made into a eunuch. Now, you have to understand what that means. That means his sexual organs were removed before they invented anesthetic and before they invented antibiotics, which means that only 1 in 10 of the slaves that were brought, that were made eunuchs survived the surgery. Only 1 in 10. And it was brutal beyond your wildest imagination. Because after they did this surgery, they literally took the people that they had surgically altered and buried them up to their necks in sand. The reason they did that was that the sand would desiccate you. That means pull out the water in your body. And if you survived, if the bleeding stopped, what do you have left? You're never going to get married. You're never going to have children. Nobody wants you. That's what happened to Daniel. Now, if anybody had an opportunity to complain, if anybody had an opportunity to play the victim card, if anybody had an opportunity or a reason to give in to the pressures and the temptations of the things that were around him, it was a man like that. Daniel had every opportunity, he had every reason, but instead, Daniel chose the higher road. He chose the road of meekness. And what it was a determination. I will be strong. I will stand for what is right, no matter what they do to me, no matter where I am, no matter what happens, I stand for what is right. That's meekness. And it nearly cost him his life just in the surgery alone. But immediately afterwards, there was another test of whether or not he was going to stand. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, it says this, but Daniel resolved, and that word is related to meekness, by the way. He resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. See, that food was not acceptable. It had been sacrificed to idols. There was blood in it. It was unacceptable to a Jewish person. And he said, I can't do this. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, look, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. The official very much knew the results here. Nebuchadnezzar basically had two rules, my way or death. Which do you choose? That's what the official was saying. He was saying, look, you're a part of this program now. You're going to be one of the diplomats in the kingdom. You're a eunuch. It's my job to train you. If you start looking bad, it's not just your head that might roll, it's mine too. That's what the official is saying. But I want you to understand that Daniel was absolutely determined to stand for the truth no matter what the temptation was. And the temptation was very, very real. I mean, think about it for a second. The king's table. This is the best food in the history of the human race up to that point. The best cooks, the best of everything. Do you think you give anything less to the king of Babylon? And he was eating from the king's table. That means he ate the same thing the king ate. It was the best of the best. Not only was it the best of the best, but it was undiluted wine. It was the wine that you got that was the good stuff, not the stuff that you pass out to the guests. This was the best, and everybody else was doing it, right? Everybody was a part of the program. The cost was incredibly high. He could lose his head, or worse, the Babylonians were really good at skinning people alive. That was one of their personal favorite ways to kill you. That takes a little while, and it's not a lot of fun. That's what he was facing. But he had a determination. You see, we have the same problem in today's world. Listen to me on this. We have exactly the same problem in today's world. I mean, Satan's table, he offers the best of what the world has to offer, doesn't he? I mean, you could go out there in the world and find any kind of sexual indulgence you want. Right now, today, legally, right here in this country, you could find anything you want. And everybody else is doing it. You can find the undiluted wine if you want to, and everybody else is doing it. And the cost of not doing it is literally being burned alive on Facebook about what a prude you are, about how judgmental you are because you won't participate in those things. Isn't that true? It's the same thing. Now, well, the only difference is that they might be skinning you alive on Facebook is a whole lot different than losing your epidermis, which is what Daniel was facing. It was a little bit tougher in his case. But he didn't back down. Why did he not back down? Because he understood what meekness was. Meekness is a free choice, a determination that you will stand resolute no matter what the temptation is and no matter what the consequence that people are threatening you with when you say, no, I will not live that way. Because they will ostracize you on social media. If they haven't already, if you stand for Jesus, they will. How many of you have experienced this, seen it, understand what I'm talking about? Seen it on Fox News or CNN, which I call the Communist News Network. But anyway, going on. That was just an aside. It was not in my notes. But being a Christian means something. It means being determined to carefully and willingly stand for what is right, no matter the cost. And it's a decision that you have to make. And it's not easy, and the reward is later. But you have to decide what kind of a person you're going to be. Aragorn had to make that same decision. And the way Tolkien wrote his character is he went up against challenge after challenge after challenge after challenge, where the temptation to quit, the temptation to, why am I putting up with this exile? Why am I putting up with this? Why am I putting up with that? Why don't I take the easier road and just take the ring? Does that make sense? Tolkien was trying to get it across to you the same way the Bible's trying to get it across to you, that temptation will be there, but true nobility, true greatness is meekness, where you take that desire, that emotional desire to reach out and grab the ring. Instead, you keep it under control. That's what meekness is. And how many of you know that Aragorn was the more noble character by far? Daniel 1, in real life, Daniel was Aragorn. Look what happened, verse 11. So Daniel then says to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, those were his friends, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. In other words, if this doesn't work, kill us. That's what he's saying. Do you get that? So he agreed to this. And he tested them for 10 days, and at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. I want you to notice several things about this. First of all, Daniel is not compromising in any way. He's saying, look, I understand the consequences here. Test us in this, and if it doesn't work, we would rather die. We get the consequences here, pal. We understand it. But I also want you to notice that he says, please. Did you notice that? And then he says, test your servants. Now let's think about this for a second. Daniel might have felt, I'm probably confident he did feel, a right to be belligerent. After all, this is the enemy. I didn't sign up for this. I didn't ask to be deported. I didn't ask to be in this program. I didn't ask to be forced to learn Akkadian, which is the most difficult language in antiquity, and that's what I have to learn to speak now. I didn't ask to learn how to read and write, which is more than 3,000 characters I'm going to have to memorize. I didn't ask for this program. He had every right, and I'm sure every temptation to be a little bit, hostile. And if you're honest with yourself, most of you would have been a little bit on the hostile side. Anybody willing to admit that, or am I the only one? Okay, because I know what I would have said, and it wouldn't have been nice. I need to learn something from Daniel, and so do you. You see, meekness is a power that's under control. And it's so much under control that even in that moment, it's decent. It's decent. Again, if you go back to the story of the Lord of the Rings, you will find that Aragorn is decent, noble, even in his discussion with his enemies. You'll find that throughout the story. That's what Daniel is doing here. Decency does not mean compromise. He was still fully prepared to die for his faith, but he was respectful. He was respectful in the way he stood up for things. Now, this is really, really important because there is a time for confrontation. There is a time for battle. There is a time to be angry. There's no doubt about that because even in our story, Aragorn was willing to fight. Daniel is willing to give his life if that's what's necessary. But meekness is a determination to be respectful, and it's a determination to give peace a chance, no matter how angry you feel, no matter how victimized you feel, no matter how unfair the situation is. It was unfair to Daniel. He had a right to be angry. They were mistreating him. But meekness is the strength of that emotion, that anger, under control. I will stand up for what is right, and I'm willing to give my life for it. And I'll say please and thank you on the way in. That's noble. That's power. And that's what Daniel did. And God honored it, which is why after the test, he looked better than everybody else. Now, how in the world can I apply this type of a thing into my personal life? Well, let's think about our families. I talked about it at the beginning. I said, a man has a strength and a power. If it's not under control, he becomes abusive. You see, meekness is where I take you because your kids are going to make you mad. I have them. They will make you mad. Really? Did you know that? How many of you know your husband, ladies, is really going to irritate you? Make you mad. I don't see any hands. You are all in trouble. Let me say that again. How many wives know their husband's going to make them mad? Come on. Honesty now. They're all like, don't want him to see. Okay, guys, try you. How many of you know your wife is really going to irritate you? He waves his hand. He's like, that's going to happen. But meekness is always being decent. Meekness is always a choice of decency. See, in your anger and in your frustration, you should never, and I do mean never, resort to name-calling, insults. Be angry, do not sin. Be angry, control is meekness. It's where I have the power and I'm mad. I'm fighting mad. But I've got the nobility of Jesus Christ in me. And because I have that, I don't mean to be mean, but I'm going to pick on my own wife. If I'm mad at her, it happens occasionally. But if I get mad at her, is she not the workmanship of the living God? Say yes. Is that not the image of God right there? Then how dare I tear it down with an insult? How dare I do that? I don't care how mad you get. And ladies, it goes the other way. He will make you so mad, all you want to do is drown him in the bathtub. I get it. But he is the image of the living God. Whether it's marred or not is irrelevant. Meekness is where you say, I'm mad at you, but I will not insult you. I will not treat you with disrespect, no matter how mad I get. Daniel kept it under control. Do you think he could have gotten mad at that official and let him know what he thought in no uncertain terms? He could have, but he did not. That's why he's a hero. Meekness is a powerful, powerful thing. Being a Christian means being decent and considerate with your words and your deeds, even when faced with people you disagree with. That's why Jesus said, love your enemies. Pray for those that despitefully use you. Jesus himself did not insult those that were taking him to the cross. That's meekness. That's power under control. Jesus himself said, do you realize that by a thought I could have a legion of angels here and wipe you all out? That's power, and it was under control. Under control. But how many of you know that 3 days later, when the time was right, he used that power and blew that stone right out and stepped out of that grave and said, I own it. I own death. I am the king. That's power. And it's used when it's supposed to be used. There's a time for a husband to stand up and say, I'm in command. There's a time for that. To defend his wife and his kids, there's a time for that. There's a time for a mom to stand up for her kids. There's a time. But your strength is under control and it's guided by the wisdom of the living God, not by just your emotions. Are you with me? That's what meekness is. It takes a lot of practice. How many of you can tell that this requires a whole lot of wisdom? You're only going to get that if you're studying the Word and understanding it. So let's go on. Oh, I hope you're taking notes. Daniel chapter 1, verse 16 says, so the guard took away all their choice food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. And then these 4 young men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. See, a person who practices meekness is blessed. Every time. His marriage is blessed. Her marriage is blessed. Her relationship with her children is blessed if you practice that. How many of you know that a mother whose emotions are never under control and is constantly lashing out at her kids is not helping that relationship? See, we need daddies that the kids want to run to instead of away from. We need mothers that their children are coming and saying, Mom, give me, help me, love on me, comfort me, instead of, I can't stand you, get away from me because all you ever do is tear me down. Are you with me? Meekness is a power and a strength that's so under control. You know, I love my children, but I know that all 5 of them still fear their father. Nathan's nodding his head. So is Jimmy. Why? They don't fear me, that I'm not going to hurt them. They know that. But they know that their dad is a man you just don't mess with. But it's a strength that's under control, so they're not afraid to come to me when they need to. Does that make sense? That's meekness, I hope. I'm working on that. Have I blown it a few times? Yeah. Yes, I have. I'm not Aragorn yet. I'm not Jesus yet. Working on it. But you know what I've also learned about meekness? Listen to me, because I see it right here in this verse. Meekness is being strong. It's being determined, but it's also being teachable. Are you with me? It's teachable. It's not dogmatic. What's the difference between being teachable and dogmatic? Dogmatic is where you are so entrenched that you are right that you cannot or will not logically engage to explain yourself. You're just right. Get out of my face. That's dogmatic, not meek. Meek is teachable. Meek is willing to engage in a conversation logically, biblically, to explain yourself. See, a person who just says, I'm right, that's it, end of discussion. Not even willing to explain why. You might be right. There are too many Christians that are like this. They're dogmatic. They'll deal with people in the world and we're right, that's it. But you don't explain why. I have news for you. You are right. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and there's no other way to God except through Him. You're right. But if you're not willing to be teachable, to learn how to explain that, to learn how to logically, reasonably engage your culture, then you're not meek, you're dogmatic. And there's a difference between standing up for the truth and being a jerk about it. Big difference. Big difference. Big difference. And we need to know what that difference is. See, Daniel knew that difference. He was teachable. He was so teachable, he learned the languages. And guys, you got to understand, Akkadian was a wildly difficult language to learn. But he learned more than just Akkadian. He had to learn several other diplomatic languages in that time period. He rose to become third most powerful person in the entire kingdom, a superpower. This is like being Secretary of State. He's right at the top. How do you get there? If you're not teachable, if you don't understand the literature, if you don't understand what's going on in this culture, you're not going to rise to that kind of a level of effectiveness, are you? You see, meekness is a power and a determination, but it's also teachable. It allowed him to be able to logically, reasonably engage in a conversation. Guys, you got to understand, he suffered through 3 regime changes during his life. Those kingdoms fell, and other kings came in and took over. And they never messed with Daniel. Why? Because we want that guy. How many of you want to be that guy at your job? How many of you would like to be that guy in your marriage where your wife says, can't do without him? Not, is he dead yet? No, we don't want to be there. Okay? Meekness is different. Being teachable. Meekness is a disciplined decision to be teachable. It's a decision, a willingness to improve your understanding of why the Bible is the truth and how to engage this culture when you talk about it. That's what meekness is. It's a willingness to understand how to engage people that disagree with you. And it's really, 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 really important that you do. Jesus understood how to engage the people around him, and he did it logically, and he did it so well, he stumped them. They could not even respond to him. It takes a lot of training. Now, the interesting thing about Daniel is that he stayed in training for more than 60 years. He died in his 80s. He was a teenager when he was brought to Babylon. And he never quit learning, and he never quit training throughout his career, which is why at the end of his life, he was every bit as noble as he was at the beginning. There are too many people that I went to school, I'm done learning. No, you're not. I read the Bible once, I'm good. No, you're not. No, you're not. My grandfather read through the Bible cover to cover more than 50 times. And he was still finding things in it. He was still learning and still growing in his 80s on his deathbed, because that's meekness. It's a determination to be teachable all the way to the end. For example, there are too many of us that quit learning about how to be biblically married. We figure things are good now. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So we don't learn anything. We're not teachable. Worse, you end up having problems and you know it's all the other person's fault, so you're not going to learn anything. He needs to learn. She needs to learn. No, you need to learn. Whoever you are. Now listen, being teachable is absolutely crucial to being a disciple of Jesus Christ, because the word disciple means student. Jesus did not call you to be anything less than his student. And if you quit being teachable, if you're just so dogmatic, I understand it, I'm right, I know, end of discussion. If you're not willing to be teachable, if you don't have a willingness in your heart to say, I can learn more, I can do better, then you're not meek. And if you're not meek, you're not following the example of who Jesus is and who Jesus wants you to be. Now listen, I want to show you where this goes, and I want to wrap it up relatively quick. I'm running out of time. Daniel took this meekness to the extreme. Listen to me on this. His willingness to be teachable, his willingness to keep his strength under control, his willingness to be determined to stand for what is right no matter what the cost, brought him all the way to the lion's den, didn't it? He was in his 80s. In his 80s. And he was thrown into the lion's den because he would not pray to anyone but God alone. And because he was willing to stand for the truth. And he wasn't being a jerk about it. He just said, well, that's your law, but this is mine. And when they arrested him and they threw him in the lion's den, the king's heart was literally cut. He didn't sleep all night long. He was just, what have I done? Because he knew the nobility of who Daniel was. But in the morning, Daniel chapter 6, verse 25, says King Darius sent this message to the people. See, he came back. He found that Daniel was alive. God had done a miracle and the lions hadn't touched him, and he pulled him out. And he said, listen to me. This is what's so important. If you follow meekness in your marriage, your wife will look at you and go, now, that's a witness. Now I know. There are plenty of unbelieving spouses that have become Christians because of the example of a husband or a wife who serves the living God. There are plenty of children that have done that. Went, wow. I mean, I'm one of those. I look up to my father. I look up to my grandfather. I talk about them all the time. Why? Because that meekness, that power under control has been a witness to me. It turned my heart, and it turned the heart of a king. It turned the heart of a king. It says, then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you, he said. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. Wow. For he is the living God. He will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. It was Daniel's meekness that turned the heart of a king. And husbands, it could be your meekness that could turn the heart of your wife. Wives, it could be your meekness that turns the heart of your husband. Your children. Meekness is power under control. Meekness is a determination to stand for the truth no matter what it takes. Meekness is a willingness to be teachable. Being a Christian means being disciplined to know all you can about how to engage others in a quiet and selfless way, even when it's as hard as facing lions. That's meekness. Meekness can turn your marriage around.